So I just click through.
Good evening, welcome. My name is Alain-Philippe Durand, I'm the Dorenzin of the College of Humanities, and it's a pleasure to welcome all of you for this event of the Tucson Humanities Festival. I would first like to read the land acknowledgement for the University of Arizona. We respectfully acknowledge the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of indigenous peoples. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the O'odham and the Yaqui. Committed to diversity and inclusion, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign native nations and indigenous communities through education offerings, partnerships, and community service. This month, like every year in October, we celebrate the National Arts and Humanities Month, and this is during this month that we host for several years now, more than 11 or 12 years, I think, the Tucson Humanities Festival, sponsored by the College of Humanities. Every year for this festival, we choose a theme, and the theme for this year is community. We would like to thank the University of Arizona Health Sciences Innovation in Health Aging Program for sponsoring tonight's event and being in this beautiful space. We would also like to thank our Tucson Humanities Festival sponsors who helped make the festival possible, especially Bookman's Entertainment Exchange and the Humanities Seminars Program. We would like to thank as well Bookman's for the gift card we are giving away tonight. If you did the enter to win, please make sure to stay to the end of the talk for the drawing. Plus, you are invited to join us for a little dessert after the event ends, so please do not rush off when the panel ends. There will be some sugar after that to enjoy. Yeah, good thing we didn't have that before the panel, I think. Tonight we have the pleasure of listening to a panel of faculty members from Religious Studies and Judaic Studies to honor Robert A. Burns, a University of Arizona Religious Studies professor for 45 years. You will hear much more about his legacy throughout the program tonight. I would now like to introduce Dr. Karen Sitt, who is Distinguished Head of the Religious Studies program. Dr. Sitt was hired by Bob Burns in 2001 as his second hire for the Religious Studies program. Dr. Sitt specializes in U.S. religious history, American evangelicalism, and gender studies. In 2012, she began serving as director of the Religious Studies program, and in 2014, she was appointed head of the Department of Religious Studies and Classics. And as I just said, and this happened this past year, she was selected by the University of Arizona as distinguished head at the university this past year. In addition, Dr. Sitt serves as director of the School of International Languages, Literatures, and Cultures, known as SILC. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Karen Sitt. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean Duran. Good evening. So glad all of you could join us tonight, either here in person or through live stream. I think we have a number of students who are watching this tonight on live stream, so you're all welcome. We're glad you're here. I feel privileged to be here tonight to honor the legacy of Dr. Robert Burns, who I worked closely with for many years, from when I was hired in 2001 until his retirement in 2016. Before I begin talking about him tonight, though, I'd like to take a moment to honor another incredible person I was lucky enough to have as a colleague and friend. Just want to take a moment to recognize and remember our dear colleague, Dr. Tom Meixner, who was shot and killed on campus on October 5th. Dr. Meixner was a University of Arizona professor and head of the Department of Hydrology and Atmospheric Sciences. He studied how water influences biology and geology across diverse environments, with a focus on the American Southwest. Tom was a cancer survivor whose positive approach to life inspired his faculty, students, and colleagues. I know from my own conversations with him over the years that he had a lively interest in all topics under the sun, including global religions and their influence on cultures and societies. He was a beloved member of the university community and will truly be missed. So tonight's panel will be honoring the legacy of Dr. Bob Burns, as we knew him. He was known by different names. Some of you knew him as Rob, others Bob. I always called him Bob. And we're continuing his legacy by thinking about global religions in our community. Religious studies at the University of Arizona, like other major universities, is an essential humanities discipline. There's few other topics that really get us at the heart of the human experience, few other things that have shaped humanity, culture, society, than religion. So our students are able to study deeply, broadly, and deeply how religion has shaped the human experience in the College of Humanities here through our Religious Studies program. And that's the wonderful legacy of Bob Burns to the University of Arizona and the larger community. He was a professor of religious studies at U of A for 45 years, from 1971 to his retirement in 2016. He had a really amazing life, and many of you who are here know parts of these stories and have celebrated that life with us as he has just recently passed away this June. He was someone who had both a personal and a professional connection to religion, which isn't always the case for those of us who study religion professionally. But At a young age, he had the opportunity to become a professional baseball player with the White Sox, but instead chose to become a Catholic priest and was ordained in 1961. But even as a Catholic priest, he always had a driving passion for interreligious understanding. You can see the sense of shock in this headline from 1964 that a Catholic priest was going to be a Reformation Day speaker. He went to get his PhD in the 1960s and decided to study Protestantism, not Catholicism, and became a scholar of Protestantism as part of his early efforts for interreligious sort of understanding. This was a time when anti-Catholicism was rampant in the United States. This is the period when Protestants were shocked and horrified that John F. Kennedy was elected as the first Catholic president, the only Catholic president until our current one, Joe Biden. And I imagine that the sense of being misunderstood or maligned by a dominant religious majority shaped Bob Burns into someone who would dedicate his life to interreligious understanding and diversity. He joined the faculty of the University of Arizona in 1971, soon after he finished his PhD, and launched the religious studies program here soon after. He was an enormously popular professor. We've estimated he taught maybe some 20,000 students in his 45 years here. And he won many teaching awards, the 5-Star Faculty Award. You can see this clip from Tucson magazine in June 1978, where he's listed as among the 10 most popular university professors. It says it's in alphabetical order, but I like it that he's number 1 there. And many, throughout Tucson, everywhere I go, if someone went to U of A during Bob's time here, there's a good chance they'll say, oh, you're in religious studies. I took a course with Professor Burns. He was amazing. So we continue that legacy today. The many students he impacted and mentored and taught over the years. He was a fixture in the Tucson community, regularly giving talks throughout the community. And when I came to U of A in 2001, the first semester I taught here was when 9/11 happened. And he was really committed in the aftermath to making sure the community understood more about Islam. And he was really instrumental in making sure we had our first hire in Islamic studies soon after that, which was Scott Lucas, who is on our panel tonight. And his last book was called Christianity, Islam in the West, as part of his efforts to increase kind of community understanding about religion and religious diversity and understanding our Muslim community here in Tucson and around the world. So today our religious studies program is thriving. We have 8 tenure stream faculty members now specializing in a broad range of areas from Native American religious traditions to Hinduism, to history of Christianity, to religion, science, and medicine. We have a really amazing career track faculty who carry on that legacy of teaching thousands of students every year in their religious studies courses. And we continue to have partnerships all around the university because religious studies is so central to so many disciplines. We have 25 faculty affiliates from classics to Africana studies, Judaic studies, East Asian studies, the Center for Buddhist Studies, Division for Late Medieval Reformation Studies, Asian American Studies, and so on. So it's really quite an amazing place to study religion here at the University of Arizona. And because we have such an interdisciplinary faculty, religious studies majors can specialize in so many different areas of interest within religion, whether it's Asian religions, indigenous religions. We have a track on religious studies for health professionals. We have a lot of students who go on to med school. I was speaking to one of our alumni tonight about how so many of our students have gone on to law school. So we're very fortunate to be able to offer such a robust education in religious studies here. And we have alumni all over the world now in professions, every imaginable profession, whether it's law or medicine, education, business, and more. And we love hearing from our alumni. If you're an alumni watching tonight or here with us, please do reach out. We really love to connect with you. Okay, I am going to turn it over to our panelists now, and I'll ask them to introduce themselves briefly, and we have a few areas we're going to discuss as a panel, and then we're going to turn it over to community discussion at the end. And then if you stay to the very end, if you entered your name in the raffle, I think I'm the lucky person who gets to choose the name who's our raffle winner tonight, so stay tuned for that. So to start off our panel tonight, our conversation, I just thought I would ask all of you to introduce yourself to the audience and your area of specialization, and then we'll get this conversation going. So Alex, do you want to get us started tonight?
My name is Alex Nava, and my field is religion in Latin America and religion in hip-hop studies. And I was a student of Bob, so I'm going to talk about that, of course, in a bit.
Hi, I'm Descheel. I am a professor of Buddhism in Tibet and Nepal, and I was very fortunate to be hired in my first year here as a Burns Fellow.
Hi, everyone. I'm Caleb Simmons. I'm an associate professor of religious studies and had the great pleasure of working with Bob for several years. And I also have to say, I'm just delighted to see you all in person again, to see so many familiar faces that over the 8 years that I've been here, through our connection with Bob, have been able to build community and come together and celebrate his legacy.
Good evening, I'm Scott Lucas. I'm an associate professor of Islamic studies. When I was hired, maybe the third hire by Bob, I didn't realize I was number 3, that's nice. I was 49% in religious studies and 51% in a department called Near Eastern Studies, which is now called School of Middle Eastern and North African Studies. But we've had great relations with religious studies. It's been a joy being colleagues with everyone here.
And we had a bit of a hard time narrowing down the panel to just figure out who's going to be on the panel tonight, because as you see, we have so many people who do religion at U of A, but we've narrowed it down to people who were hired by Bob or were hired as a result of the Robert A. Burns Endowment Fund, such as Ray being a Burns Fellow. So maybe we could start by talking about Bob's legacy, and you could tell us a little bit about, how you were impacted by Bob's leadership and how you would describe his impact on the university and the larger community.
As I mentioned, I was a student of Bob Burns, and he had a tremendous impact on my life. I stumbled into one of his classes. I was a pre-med student, and I didn't grow up, I'm a first-generation college graduate, I didn't grow up surrounded by books. So I think he was the first to expose me to the world of ideas. And I have to say that it was something like a revelation to me and an epiphany, that it opened up this new world, and it was rich with possibility, and it kind of showed me a new way of being in the world. And it was like discovering a new language, or like discovering a new world itself, an undiscovered world where there's these exotic curiosities and wonders. And he exposed me to all of that for the first time. And it wasn't only him, and it wasn't only religious studies. I remember he introduced me to Heiko Obermann, the great Reformation scholar. So I was taking courses in history. I ended up in courses in Greek philosophy with Julia Annis and Robert Gemello in Buddhism. And even I remember, this class was actually more influential. I've been thinking about it lately. He was a professor in political science. It was on Irish history. but he was one of the first to kind of expose me. His name was O'Neill, to the notion of liberation theology, which was a movement that was arising out of the third world countries or Latin America and Africa. And they were all really influential. So it was really about the humanities in a broad sense that, you know, for the first time, again, it was like I was filled with a sense of wonder. And the joy of learning, I think he communicated to me for the first time. And I think, again, for him, the question of religion was like an essential part of the humanities. And it was like, what makes us human? And I think he was really good about like exploring the spiritual dimension through human cultures and different traditions and customs. And I think that's not always the case in the study of religion, and we're going to talk about that later, but I think he was really good about showing why this mattered for your life. Like how these ideas can make you a better and more complete human being. That was what I think resonated with so many of his students, of like making us more thoughtful, interesting, curious, compassionate human beings, like better people. I think that was something that drove a lot of his teaching. And he appealed, of course, to both insiders of the religious traditions and outsiders. It wasn't just one particular group. And he always did it, the last thing I'll say, he always did it with humor, like throughout all his classes. In fact, one anecdote, I went to visit him, and this was recently. I'm not talking about when I was a student. This was recently when he was at the retirement facility on River, and his mind wasn't as strong as it used to be. His memory wasn't as strong, and his body definitely wasn't as strong. And I was walking with him, pushing him in a wheelchair, and a man walked by and said, "Oh, Bob, is this your son?" And right away, with a smile on his face, he said, "I don't think so." But almost like, I could be wrong, but, you know. So he still had that, like, sharp wit, the Irish wit. And that was a huge, like, element in his teaching, his storytelling, his jokes, and connecting with his students on a very human level.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. That was a great segue, because one of my strongest memories of Bob, he used to teach a very popular class that went from Judaism to Christianity to Islam. And he was very humble. And once I was hired, he would often invite me to come to the class and give a lecture. And he would usually say, you know, and he said this several semesters, you know, we do a survey at the beginning where people self-assess how much they know about Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And he's like, so for Christianity, it's a 7. Highly inflated. Every year, highly inflated, in a way that only a priest could say, you know, they don't really know anything about Christianity. Judaism, maybe 3 or 4, and Islam 1, or even less than 1. And he was like, and you know, this is why it's so important. And I have to say, back when I was starting to work here, this was, as Karen mentioned, September 11th had happened, the US-led invasion of Iraq had happened. It wasn't a great time to be teaching Islam necessarily, although there was a lot of interest, but not always for the right reasons. And it was a tricky time for being a Muslim as well. And so seeing someone who could both be clearly very committed to one religious tradition and also teach a variety of religions was extremely inspirational and really helped make that transition from graduate student to fledgling professor a lot easier.
Thanks so much. Just to follow up on his humor, one thing that his students have often talked about in alum is how he was so committed to trying to present all the religions as objectively as possible. And one of his favorite stories, and the Monsignor told this at his funeral, to everyone's kind of shock and awe, but the student came up to him at the end of the semester after his comparative religions course and said, "Professor, I was just wondering, you teach all these religions. Do you have a particular religious preference?" And Bob said, "Yeah, a little bit. I'm a Catholic priest." And the student said, "No shit! Oh, sorry. Oh," and that was always his favorite. That the students couldn't tell at the end of his comparative religions courses. So, you've touched on some of this in the personal influence, but why do you think that Bob's legacy, the impact on U of A, why is it important at a land-grant secular public university like this to have these religious studies courses for our students in the larger community? Would one of you like to take that?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Because a lot of it I'll draw from personal experience that might mirror some of Bob's experiences, but from a radically different context. I personally always went to state schools, and when I grew up in, some of you have heard my personal biography, grew up in a very small rural context in the panhandle of Florida, so all your Florida man stereotypes, that was me, and had a very narrow view of the world and view of religious traditions. And when I went to university, wound up taking something that I thought was going to be easy, because I grew up in a religious household, so I'll take Introduction to World Religions. Honestly, much like Alex experienced, it blew my mind, because I just hearing an unbiased, impartial presentation of beliefs and practices that weren't aligned with my own really made me see the humanity in other people that I had thought, at that point, and just people destined for hell. And that was about it. And while it seems like such a potentially small thing, when I think about it now, it actually is a radical experience of expanding one's understanding of our neighbors, our community, just to be able to see that people born in a different context see the world differently, see the cosmos differently. And while we talk about why it's important in the state, is because often this is going to be the one opportunity for students to hear that. And they can go the rest of their life back in a community that might have a more singular view, and then you get wrapped in your own way of seeing things. And this is that opportunity to show students that there's more out there. People think differently, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it's additive. It brings about variety, which is a good thing. And so I think having that legacy here, founded on the idea of diversity, religious minorities, instructing people in the way other people view the world, actually is, creating a better world. And I don't say that flippantly. I actually do think the work that we're doing helps make the world better.
Would you like to?
Yeah, I think also we face particular challenges at a public university to how we teach religion and the anxieties students have about learning about other religions. So, sometimes I encounter students who say, well, religion is responsible for the worst atrocities that our world has seen. Religion is divisive. And I think one of the really rewarding things in the gen ed classroom is seeing students start to break that down. So, for example, in my Buddhism and healing class, students recently came up with this, proposal that I found really helpful. Like, misogyny becomes Buddhist when, karma is used to justify inequity, right? And so then suddenly we could use that formula and apply it to other situations to be like, this kind of inequity becomes something religious when this religious principle is used to explain an inequity. And so then it was no longer, well, this religion is misogynist or this religion is hateful in some way, but looking at, in a more complex and nuanced way at those power dynamics and how they work in a given situation. And then on the other side, the reward of seeing where religions are used to bring about good. also. So, students seeing where, for example, in the contemporary world, Buddhism is being used as a resource for activism, and also for activists who are trying to kind of refill the well and, face seemingly impossible challenges by sustaining their bodies and minds through religious practice. So those are some of my thoughts.
Thank you so much, Ray. You all teach a wide range of different courses, and talking about the power of studying religion at a land-grant institution like this to try to understand humanity, our neighbors, our community better. What are some misperceptions about religions or the particular religions you specialize in that you come across often that you've been able to kind of help students get beyond or grapple with a little bit? And we'll start with our Islamic studies professor.
It's interesting. I mean, when I started, I guess the misperception was, of course, of Muslims all being violent and hating Americans because we're Americans and things like that, which I'm not sure how many of the students had, but now the students were born after September 11th that we have in the classroom. So it's a whole, I used to be old talking about the Iranian Revolution. That makes me look like a dinosaur, right? But like, even September 11th is something these kids didn't see, right? Or they were extremely small when it happened. And so I think now I don't even know if they have misperceptions. Like, I'm not even sure they have perceptions. And so it's very exciting because there are a lot of Muslim students here. There's a mosque that's now surrounded by high-rise dorms, which has created a lot of interesting, unpleasant situations, but that's the reality. The Muslims got good real estate and they haven't sold it yet. So it's there. And so there are Muslims around, there are a lot of Muslim students here, so I think it's beneficial for them to learn that. But I'm not even sure they have misperceptions at this point, because unless you grow up with Muslims in your neighborhood, you might not really know anything at all about Islam in this country.
So for this generation, the media hasn't necessarily been pounding that in as it might have been during the early 2000s, or?
I hope. Maybe I'm wishful thinking, but I hope.
Thank you.
And I'll jump in after that because I teach two popular classes, and one I kind of lean into misperceptions. It's the class I teach on the history of yoga, which was intentionally named just yoga. So students, we get a lot of people, fewer now, but would show up with their yoga mats and their water bottles, and then they see a paunchy 40-year-old in front of them, and they think, where am I? So it's, and then using sort of that perception of this is what yoga is, and then we sort of do a shock to their system and jump back, and the first thing we read is just a translation of the Bhagavad Gita. So immediately it's playing off of this, what you think you know and what's comfortable, and using that to bridge to another world. But the other class that I teach is for freshmen, and teaching freshmen is one of the most fulfilling experiences you can have in your whole life. They're bright-eyed, they're bushy-tailed, they're eager, they read, and so it's such a nice time. And so the course that I teach is titled Gods, Goddesses, and Demons, and then the subtitle drills it down a little bit more, Divinity in South Asia. And the students also were shocked with our first reading because we actually read Rudolf Otto's The Idea of the Holy. So a Lutheran theologian is the first thing we read to understand what, perhaps we have as our baseline understanding of what divinity is, or what holy is. And then we jump into the South Asian world and we talk about righteous demons, gods that are committing adultery and doing all these things, to kind of try to take the received knowledge, what is true, gods are good, demons are bad, and actually interrogate that. What do these concepts mean? How are we applying them differently cross-culturally? And we get into translation studies and things like that as well. But to be able to move people from what they feel they know very comfortably to something very, very foreign, and often, they see it as very exotic, actually gives students the opportunity to think more freely and try to become a little bit more agile in the process. And by the end, what we find is some of the preconceptions, misconceptions, or just perceptions in general, they've actually for themselves been able to work through some of these things, and by the end, that where they started with received knowledge and assumptions, now by the end they understand that a lot of this is contextually based. So it's the power of a semester that can really help move people into a new direction of thought.
Either of you want to talk?
I think that there's all these sorts of perceptions. I think on the one hand, it's related to what I said about kind of that Bob spoke to both insiders and outsiders of the religious traditions, which is tricky in a lot of ways, because on the one hand, there's misconceptions of religious studies is doctrinal, dogmatic, and people want to avoid it for those reasons. On the other hand, you have people that aren't familiar with religious traditions, that are actually more of the insiders that think of religious studies as like all the professors are agnostic and atheist. There's that perception as well. So I think Bob was really good about challenging both misconceptions. I think he shows the possibilities, the richness, the resources of the variety of religious traditions, and the way in which they are self-critical. And I think for him, one thing that I recall him often talking about is the notion of faith, which is one of those terms that can be really misconstrued. But I loved the way he distinguished it from belief, that he didn't think that they were synonymous, that he didn't think it was just about believing certain abstract propositions that makes one, in this case, in certain cases, a Christian, for example. But he thought that faith was actually synonymous with hope and love, and that it was particularly a particular way of life, a certain way that you live your life that revealed your faith, and that it wasn't about doctrinal like propositions. And so I think he was always really good about challenging and unsettling, certainly challenging people, on the other hand, that came into the classroom thinking that, that religion is certainly just affiliated or in solidarity with the right wing. I mean, he would unsettle those perspectives. And he was really good about just challenging anybody who was a little too self-satisfied in their belief.
Yeah, I like that, and I think that's something that we all strive to do as humanities professors, whatever the topic. Just always get in there and shift the thinking just a little bit. Just shake up anything that's a little too stuck in a rut and oversimplified. Just one brief example I'll give for one of my courses. I've taught for many years a course called Women in Christianity that's cross-listed with gender and women's studies. And there are students who will enroll in it with the religious studies prefix and students who will enroll in the gender and women's studies prefix. And this one semester, they were all going around talking about what they had learned from the course so far. And a lot of the students, it's kind of a stereotype too, but there's some students from the gender and women's studies prefix that just wanted to learn about how Christianity was just bad for women. And in all of our courses, I think we try to show sort of the broad range of possibilities and realities and all of these things and the complexities and the double-edged swords. And so some of the gender and women's studies students said, well, I've started to learn that Christianity is more complex than I thought it was when it comes to the history of gender. And then the religious studies students were saying, well, I was really worried about studying with these gender and women's studies students, but I'm actually learning a lot about gender. Gender and women's studies is not that bad, and I'm really actually kind of interesting. And so it's kind of nice to see both ways. They were kind of shaking up their perceptions of what the course was going to be. But I think any course that is able to kind of shake up students' preconceptions, whatever they are, when they arrive, is a successful course in our humanities curriculum. So in talking about the theme of this Tucson Humanities Festival, and some of you have alluded to it more, I mean, how can religious studies and learning about religious diversity, how does that help us think more deeply about the concept of community? How can that bring meaning to our festival for this conversation today?
So, I mean, Bob's legacy obviously speaks to community. From a Buddhist perspective, one of the core practices of Tonglen is exchanging self for other. You work on widening your kind of circle of care, right? So starting with the people that are most immediate and then, working gradually through the neutral and the more challenging individuals. And, education is basically that, right? Is like you start with your position and what you're familiar with, and then you start learning about other perspectives. So I think Bob's legacy speaks to that. And also from a Buddhist perspective, the three jewels of Buddhism are the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. So the teacher, the teachings, and the Buddhist community. And in my Buddhism and healing class, I tell this story like on the first day, even though it's kind of very sad, but it really speaks to community. So there was a woman, Kisa Gotami, who lost her child. And she brought the child to the Buddha and said, "Will you please revive my child for me?" And the Buddha said, "Okay, I'll make you a deal. I want you to go to the door of everyone in this village, and if you can find one household that has not suffered loss, then I will bring your child back to life." Right? So of course, Kisa Gotami goes from door to door, and she doesn't find a single household that hasn't suffered a loss. Right? So then she comes back to the Buddha and says, "Okay, I get it. Right? What do I do now?" Right? And she becomes one of the first Buddhist women. So there are poems written by this group of women, many of whom who have lost children, actually. So, one definition of what community is a community of, people who have suffered. Right? There are also more optimistic definitions. Community, from a Buddhist perspective, is also, that we all have in common the fact that all we want is to be happy, right? Everyone has that in common. So there are different ways of coming at it, but community is absolutely at the center of the study of Buddhism.
Yeah, I can jump in. And both Ray and I study Asian religions, so there's some overlap. But one thing that we talk about in my classes quite often are reflections about identity and how we formulate who we are. And thinking about, one from as we're teaching what community means. And I always reflect on this time I was in India and trying to, position myself within the community that I was living. And they were trying to figure out who I was. And of course, my primary identity markers at the time were graduate student and, Floridian, all these things that really don't mean that much to the community. And then I eventually found out what they were getting at, because then they wanted to know my religious identity, and eventually it's complicated, and so I came up with this formula that I would tell them, and I was really proud of myself for coming to this. I said, you have a family deity and a chosen deity. I said my family deity is Jesus, my chosen deity is the goddess I do research on, and they didn't really care. They were trying to figure out what I could eat. And so your dietary restrictions are based on your religious identity. But I tell that story because our relationships in the community that we form in our own religious traditions, or whatever is a meaningful community for you, it winds up, it's who you are, and you're embedded within that. And in some ways, when you're teaching religion, your course becomes a microcosm of that. Because you do group work, you talk about ideas like suffering, you talk about ideas like hope, and through these discussions, students start to build a bond. And again, I look around the room, what's uniting all of us? Of course, it's Father Bob, but it's not a vertical relationship with him. It's also horizontal. Look at the relationships that you formed with this community and how strong it is and how we see each other repeatedly, and we've grown this relationship. And this is what we can do, talking about deep, meaningful subjects, as we build our own community. And it doesn't have to be religious studies, but I do think this is a subject matter that lends itself to deep connections very quickly.
And that's so great, and I just want to jump in and say hello to my students who may be watching this on live stream, but you're part of this community too now. Even if you didn't know Bob Burns, by studying religion, you're entering into this conversation in this community and part of this legacy. And we hope you're having some of these kind of amazing experiences that we've had, and that that Bob's legacy will continue on for generations into your generation and beyond, as we're able to study these really meaningful and powerful topics. Do you want to say a little bit about community too, the community here in Tucson? And
Sure. So when I first came here, there was one Sunni mosque, or sort of mainline mosque, and it was right on campus, which was very convenient. Now we have 3. So the community has grown a lot, and some of these families send their children to the U of A because it's convenient and in-state tuition perhaps, or it's a great university too. And so it's wonderful seeing some of the students come through our classes that we also see in the community, and I imagine that's in other faith traditions as well here. So that's great. And then a lot of our students come from different countries around the world, right? There are dozens of countries where Muslims live. According to Google, 1 in 4 human beings is a Muslim, so that's kind of exciting. That's according to Google. I don't know if that's correct or not, but they have a lot of researchers. One of the things we try to do in our classes too is to expand people from thinking that their country is the only sort of normal Muslim country and the rest are weird or do strange things, and to try to, I'm no expert in Indonesia or South Asia, but there are twice as many Muslims in India as in Egypt. Now, which country do we think of first when we think about Islam? We probably think of Egypt, and certainly Egyptians think of Egypt, right? They don't think, oh, we should figure out what's going on in India to know how Islam is practiced, right? That's unheard of. So there is that great opportunity. I would just stress too that, often when you're in a Muslim community, when you do interfaith or things like that, you get one day with an hour maybe to kind of try to explain your whole religion, whereas it's such a privilege to have 15, 16 weeks, it could be 14, but 15 or 16 weeks, right, with these students, and they can just learn so much in that time period. So that's just something that's great too about being part of this.
And I also want to give a shout out to our Judaic Studies program as well, and I think some of our colleagues in Judaic Studies, there's a religious studies degree and program, and then there's a whole separate Judaic Studies program and Center for Judaic Studies here at the University of Arizona, and we've always had this long, close relationship. Bob Burns was very close with Ed Wright and David Graysboard and Beth Nakai and others in the program, and we've continued that relationship. So it's also a very welcoming and exciting place to study Judaism as well, and we have students who want to study both Judaism and the broader religions, so they'll double major in Judaic Studies and Religious Studies. We have students who will double major in Religious Studies and Minas and focus on Islam. The biggest part of our Buddhist Studies program is in the East Asian Studies department. Ray has half her line in Religious Studies, half in East Asian Studies, and so we have a lot of double majors that'll do Buddhism, both in the East Asian Studies program and Religious Studies. So we have many different communities here on campus for studying major religions. Well, maybe I'll wrap up our discussion and with a final question, and then open it up for any Q&A people would like. And then beyond that, we can continue conversation more casually over the dessert menu. So we're talking about community as kind of an important, large concept, but beyond community, what are some of the big issues or big questions that the study of religion can help students engage with in meaningful ways and the larger community? Who would like to start? So Alex, would you like to, maybe you could all briefly comment on that for our final round.
I'm always been very interested in the big questions for the religious traditions. And for me, I think one of the things, again, that Bob introduced me to, I remember there was a reverend, a preacher, a black preacher, Reverend Elwood McDowell, who's still here in Tucson and still has his church, and they became really close friends, and he loved going to preach at Elwood's church, and he would often tell stories, the energy of the interaction, the call and response of being in a black church. So I remember that it really opened me up to being really much more interested and curious about learning more about black history. And I have to say that was, I grew up fascinated by hip hop. And so when I came here, I thought there were classes on jazz and rock and roll, but there was nothing on hip hop. Hip hop is a complex phenomena, as AP, our dean knows. It's just multifaceted. There's the poetry, the music, the dance, the art of DJing, and the production side, and the graffiti writing, and of course the social issues, the issues of human rights and justice. And I think that Bob planted that seed in me, the believing that if religion has any value, it has to be engaging in issues of human rights and justice. Beyond our shores. And I think that he planted that seed. He didn't get the hip hop thing. I remember when I told him I first wanted, Bob, I want to teach a class on religion and hip hop. What? What? He didn't, it was the different generation. And he really didn't understand it. And I remember the day that I told him, actually, because that he had come back and he had a remarkable impact on so many students, thousands and thousands throughout the years. But he also there were limits, even with a great teacher like Bob. And I remember because he came back from a class and he was kind of discouraged, and he got through to so many people, including a lot of athletes, that Marisol would funnel many of the athletes to his class. And he was a former baseball player, and he connected with a lot of them. But one he could not get through is Rob Gronkowski. If you don't know, he's probably the best tight end in NFL history. And he would just listen to his music, and Bob would get so frustrated with him. But Bob told me, it was a lesson in humility. That there's a limit of what you can do as a teacher. You have to be at a certain level. But I remember that, of course, that being baffled by the question of hip hop, but ultimately totally supporting it. When I give him the spiel about that, I think it's about of being a voice of the voiceless, that hip hop was giving the mics to marginalized communities and letting them speak and tell their stories. And he got that and was very supportive.
So I think one of the big questions for students is, how do I bring what I'm doing in the classroom out into the world? So that's something that we're dealing with all of the time. But I think another big question that we take on is, why is happiness, from a Buddhist perspective at least, not possible if others are suffering? So the ramifications of this are kind of using your mind to understand why you don't do good things, you don't help people because you should, right? You do it because it actually makes sense, right? Because of interdependence and so forth. So thinking philosophically about that, and then thinking about how to bring that into your own life. And another big question, just very quickly, is what makes land sacred? right? To who and why. And so, is it natural resources? Is it religious beliefs? Is it cultural history? Is it identity? These are questions that we're running up against all of the time now. And so those are some of the big questions that we're grappling with in my classes.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great question. And for me, and I think a lot of this has to do with my own background and my own positionality, and something that's been increasingly, I think, on all of our minds that I try to get to in my courses now is about diversity, equity, and inclusion, thinking about systems of power and hierarchies. And, for students who are not as open to the idea, I have the luxury of teaching about another culture. And so sometimes it's very hard to show someone themselves in the mirror from day one. But like my course on yoga, for instance, it's actually one of the primary themes of the course. And you go and think, yoga, isn't it about peace and being real flexible? Well, yeah, but it's also, like any other human institution, is built into systems of hierarchy and power. And so we spend the first part of the semester, looking at power structures in the Bhagavad Gita and in classical texts, and thinking about caste and gender discrimination in ancient India. And then all of a sudden we hit colonialism. And then now all of a sudden they have the vocabulary to understand structural inequities. Which before they may have had a knee-jerk reaction against, but now have prepared themselves to start thinking about, what was it when colonial powers went and started to establish these rules and changing societies. And then the last module we come to the U.S. And then it's time, but they've been slowly walked into this. So it's something, again, that we can do when we take this history of religions approach, is we can take things that we want our students and just society in general to be thinking about and grappling with, but we can ease them into the conversation in a way that might be more productive for people who, if you were to turn on NPR and say, listen to this story, may have immediately been, whatever, pejorative they would say at the moment, but now actually have the tools to be able to have that conversation and start to also then understand that this is something that's part of life. There are structural inequities, and these things they're in religious traditions, but they're made by people. And where there's people, there's going to be people who want to have power structures. And now we can have a different conversation moving forward, hopefully for the rest of our lives, because we've empowered the tools to have the conversation. And religious studies is a great way to start that, because people have strong opinions.
Yeah, I mean, one of the challenges of teaching religious studies is that you're not teaching religion, at least in a public university, right? So I can't make my students fast for a month. I'd probably get fired. And that's okay, I understand why I would. But so you can't really have them maybe experience what makes your religion or the religion you're teaching that. So, however, the life of the mind is something valued in the university, if maybe not enough other places where the life of the mind is valued. And so one of the privileges of teaching Islam is to try to show that there are actual Muslim thinkers who might not necessarily jive with what you're thinking or you're not thinking, but they're not influenced, or sometimes they're influenced by ancient Greeks and all. That's pretty interesting too. But they have their own sort of universe of thoughts and ideas and complex issues they're dealing with, whether it's free will and determinism, whether it's the political regime. And they have their own way of doing it that doesn't depend upon necessarily European thought or American thought. It has its own way. And that's something that, once again, in a 16-week course, because it's 16 weeks, you can actually introduce them to a wide variety of thinkers. Obviously, in the modern period, then you can see them collide, right? Where now Muslims are speaking in a very similar language, and then it gets much easier for a lot of the students to understand, because now they're speaking and using concepts. They're dealing with things like democracy or human rights and things, because everybody's talking about that in the post-colonial period. But there is that sort of opportunity for the pre-sort of colonial period where you can really show that, look, people around the world were thinking really complex ideas, and that's one of the joys of teaching this.
Just one thing I'll say, and then we want to hear your thoughts and input and questions as well. And I said a little bit of this to my class today, that especially in the last a couple of weeks with everything happening at U of A, thinking a lot about all the resources of the world for thinking about suffering or death or tragedy. And, that's one of the big questions in the study of religion, thinking about all the different ways communities have come together to grapple with the human condition and with the reality of suffering, with the reality of mortality, and just all the rich resources around the world for how communities have done that throughout time and space. So that's something that I find really meaningful right now about religious studies. And we want to turn it over now to you all. I think the way we're going to do this is just if you want to have a question, just raise your hand and I'll repeat the question and see if our panelists want to answer. Yes, please.
I was wondering, the kids that are coming to studying religion today at the university, they're experiencing this growing nexus between right-wing politics, Christian nationalism, intolerance, Islamophobia. How is that impacting the students and the baggage that they come to class with?
Okay, thank you for that very important question. I'll try to paraphrase it as best I can. Just the people coming to university today in this milieu of political intolerance, all the kind of Christian nationalism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism that's part of the landscape or polarized conversations today. How do you see that impacting students coming into the classroom, and how do you interact with that? Does that capture the question pretty well?
As much as I would like Religion of Islam to be an obligatory course for every U of A student, I haven't had success in that. So we have a pretty self-selecting group of students, and I've noticed a lot of them really want A's. And so I think if they really have a lot of those feelings, they're not taking my classes, or they're certainly keeping those opinions close to themselves, by and large. So that's my...
I've had mostly the same experience, but with some notable exceptions. And this is why I do feel privileged to teach something that's distant enough from the U.S. political context, even though it's actually really not when you dive deeper into it. But it winds up allowing students from multiple perspectives of left and right a space to think the thoughts tied to their background in a way. And so you find people, especially so in one assignment for yoga, since I'm always talking about that, they have to discuss something from their personal life as the data, as a case study to talk about some sort of power hierarchy. This is where I see some of those things coming out. There is some discussion posts that talk about critical race theory. There's been a couple times where people, who seem to, and I'm gonna be delicate with this, be taking a Hindu mythology class because they were more interested in the Aryans than they were in the Hindu mythology portion, and then it comes out in those posts. But the nice thing about collaborative work is that students are replying to them, and it actually winds up, it could go south really quickly, which is why we do moderate it, but also you find that students, if you create an atmosphere where we're trying to make it a safe place, we'll actually try to address the ideas and say, like, I don't agree with you. This is why I don't agree with you, and this is how my personal experience and data actually butts right up against that. And it can be very productive, because I think the problem is the other side's not human. Right, we're in our own insular communities, and we never get to talk across the aisle. Since we're using political, we don't. And next thing you know, when you actually have to interact with someone from a different tradition, now all of a sudden that's a human and not an idea. And so I think that it's transformative if we do it right. And of course, we all fail at this at times. So if Bob could fail, I could fail a lot. So I think that there's some of that, but religious studies provides a pathway for people to think more deeply. I will just jump in too. I mean, I've been really heartened by just how
powerful this university context is for young people to come in, and some of them are coming from these contexts where they only hear this one simplistic message, but they come into the university context and how hungry they are for a place where things are complex and not polarized and not black and white, and how many students just thrive in that kind of context when it's set up where it's not threatening for them, or we're not out to make them believe this or that, but we're having this conversation and they're entering that conversation with respect. And I teach a course, Religion and the American Experience, where we do talk about issues that are very close to students' political beliefs. I think once, again, they see that there's room for these range of views, and we're looking at a broad range of views, they find their place in that conversation and become more open to hearing the conversation where other people are coming from as well. And being in a diverse university like this is really a transformative experience for so many of them. Any other questions? Up at the top. Oh, yes, please. Oh, yes. Uh-huh.
So I have a question for you on the University Religious Council.
Yes.
And I heard about this from that council. But my question is, how do you determine what are major religions?
Oh, good question.
Major religions are included in your offering?
Yeah, thank you so much. We don't determine which are the major religions, and we offer a broad sweep. We do have Condon Smith Hansen on the faculty who specializes in Latter-day Saints. When I teach my Religion and the American Experience course, it's been a few years since I've taught that course because of my administrative duties, but I would often invite someone from the Institute to come as a guest speaker, because trying to sort of show both have someone who's an insider and, as well as sort of scholarly historical overview, and for students in the class that are from the broad range of traditions out there to kind of feel like they're included in this story. I also, in my Religion and the American Experience course, have students write a socio-religious autobiography about their own religious and ethnic heritage. And I'll say, in a university of this size, when you read one classroom full of autobiographies, you learn about the whole world because they're connected to so many religions and traditions around the world. So our goal and hope is to be as inclusive as possible. I mean, there's limits to our expertise, but we bring in, expertise where we don't have it, to make sure that's a robust conversation and students can study the religious traditions that are meaningful to them.
Can I add one thing? Because we do have an Introduction to World Religions course, and this is where that question is, foremost on our minds. So I think it's taught by multiple people, but I think all of us who teach it sort of start off with that problem, is whenever you teach, what is world religions, where's the cutoff going to be, and what does that mean? It means that you're making a decision about what's important, what's not, what constitutes a world religion, and the model itself is problematic. Of course, we move forward and we talk about the ones that are in the textbook and the course description, but it's something that we do acknowledge, because what are we saying as an entire discipline, that we have these that we acknowledge as world religion, and then those that we don't, right? So we're making this value judgment. But the nice thing about that course is that we get the students also thinking about that, and it can tie into all the other things that I've already talked about with diversity, equity, inclusion. This is what we do as humans, is we categorize, and when you categorize, you wind up cutting people off and discriminating against others. So it's a great question. I really appreciate it, and welcome back to Tucson.
Yeah. And I'll also say, I'm teaching the Abrahamic religions in a world religions course now, and when we get to the Christianity unit, usually what I say is as a religious studies professor, I I don't determine what's Christian or not, but we go by self-identification, and we study the groups, on their own terms, and so there's a lot of diversity within the Christianity category, obviously, and so try to give students a taste of that, in a short course where we cover so much. Yes. So the question is, for those of you who are religious, how does that affect your life, and how does the study of other religions impact your own religious belief system?
That's a great question. And it makes me think of something that Scott was saying about the limitations of religious studies in the classroom. He was like, you can't fast. There's a limitation. And it's really, it's part of this debate in religious studies between insiders and outsiders, like that an insider, some of the perspective of insiders is, in fact, that you only could fully understand a religion unless you engage in it and give yourself to it, practice it. I think there's a lot of truth to that. Like, it's kind of like the Black experience, that unless somebody's lived it, there's a particular perspective that they're going to give you on the Black experience. Or if you're LGBT, there's a particular perspective from that lived experience. So I think, again, the trick is, like in religious studies, these, the balance between that insider and outsider perspective. So there's, again, I think that some of our students that come in with like a more atheistic, agnostic perspective dismiss religious studies as being all doctrinal, but we also have some insiders of religious tradition that dismiss religious studies because they're all agnostics and atheists that teach religious studies. So it's really tricky. I myself, I would say I believe in the outsider perspective. I lean more on the insider perspective. I'm Catholic, and it's a big, important part of my identity. It's a big part of who I am. But I think I hearken back to a tradition that Bob represented as well, a tradition that believed that if there is a such thing as God, and there's a such thing as God's grace, that grace is present in a wide variety of peoples and cultures and religions. And that goes back to even a great Dominican like Aquinas in the Middle Ages, who believed that you can find grace in the Greeks, non-Christians. And in modern times, that's led to the idea of, so for me, studying of religious traditions, I'm obviously at odds with people that see religion in a very, very triumphalistic and exclusive way, as Bob was. But yeah, it's an important part of who I am as a person.
Yeah, I appreciate the question because it's something that you grapple with. And I want to approach it a slightly different way to respond and think about, since the theme's community, and tell a brief anecdote that some of you may have heard before. But so I'm in the Hindu temple that I studied at for my PhD, with there every day. And as the relationship grew, eventually they started giving me access to Hindu-only portions. And next thing you know, like I'm handing out prasad, which is the blessed, it's right there with the priest. And because we had a 2-year relationship where I saw him every day. And I remember in one particular festival, someone who wasn't a normal attendee of the temple came in and was very upset that a white guy was back there because of ritual purity reasons. He said I needed to remove, and the head priest came out and it's basically said, why should he have to leave? He's more Hindu than you. I see him here every day. I never see you. Right, so it wasn't actually, and this gets to the experience and what it means to be part of a community, because I don't identify as Hindu. I was ready to leave. I was like, I don't want to cause a scene. But he took up for me, not because I believed a particular way, but because I was there. And I knew them and I engaged. And so in some ways, to answer your question is, it becomes sometimes blurry how it affects your identity, because like I haven't been back to the temple now since we went with the COH, Friends of COH to Mysore. And honestly, like sometimes it hits me on Instagram. I'll see a picture of the priest and the goddess, and I get homesick. Like it's because homesick, you can't describe it, right? You just feel it. And I see it and I get homesick. And at that moment, I think like, this is my community. In maybe not the way that a religious insider would, but it's that experience that I had with them that is transformative and made me part of that.
One thing I'll jump in and say too is I have a particular heritage with connections to evangelical Protestantism, with the way I was raised, and I study evangelical Protestantism now in my own research, especially fundamentalists and conservative Christians. And so part of me in my courses, trying to keep it as neutral as possible or not bringing my own particular politics or values into it, is to make sure there's a space for everyone, even fundamentalist Christians who might be in the course, who might be turned off if there's leaning in too strong on sort of liberal Christian ideas, like, there's God in everyone or something, but trying to keep it really neutral and really objective and focused on the history, so that it's safe for even, exclusivists or sort of right-wing Christians to be in that space. But just the fact of them being in that space is a really meaningful thing for them to engage in the conversation. And I think it's important, a little piece of what I do to kind of break down barriers in our very polarized world. I think teaching religious studies from a very neutral, objective perspective kind of helps with that, in at least the area that I work in. Yes. So the question was, talking about community, how can we open up more space on campus to talk about religion and communities? And could I ask you, what kind of thing would you like to see on campus if we could open up more space for that? Mm. Right. Right. So the comment was, and you're a current student here at U of A, just taking all these courses, but still experiencing a lot of other students that still are really sticking with their sort of own particular way of thinking, or not opening up to more complex ways of thinking. Is that kind of getting at what, and how can we create more space for more of those complex conversations and so on? And I will say, my first thought is actually our religious studies majors just started a religious studies club. And so that is, I think, going to be a great space for students who really want to grapple with some of these meaty, complex questions with other students who are really interested in it, to be part of, a club of like-minded students. They're going to have some events and, talks and things they're going to read together. So I think that's a start of a space that's going to be a place where people can do that. And anyone who's interested in it, please contact me and I'll put you in touch with them. But do any of you want to speak about some of these?
I'll make you the president.
Well, you can be the president of our new club. You're very welcome. So,
I think you've just sort of encapsulated the frustrating side of being a professor as well, because I want my students, even if they start off crawling, on day 2 to start running, and I think that it's incremental growth, and as a society, I think we're so far behind that getting those incremental growth, and while it still may seem like we're not making any movement because we really are still crawling when we should be up, running, driving, flying planes, but I have to have faith that, or else it becomes very depressing, that we are making movement forward. And by talking about it, and even if students are forced to talk about it for credit, it's like anything else. The more you practice at it, the more the ideas there. And thinking about it as like from my own studies, like a karmic seed. We've planted it. It's eventually going to come to fruition. When that's going to come to fruition, hopefully it's this lifetime. But we're hopefully making the progress in the right direction.
Students like you give us hope, so thank you for being here. Yes. Right. 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 So that was talking about the interfaith, the opportunities for interfaith engagement here in Tucson, and there's a United Way event with an interfaith event to help the community, people in need in the community. And I think, again, that story about suffering, people coming together around common causes that they can unite around can really help with that. I am looking at our event coordinator. Are we at the end of our time here? Yes. Okay. Well, I think I have a few words to say to you at the end here. And
one more, but we can get that during the dessert. Just come up and ask any of us. Yeah.
Let me just say some final words. Thank you for joining us tonight. We hope you've enjoyed the discussion and hearing about Robert Burns and his contributions to the University of Arizona and to religious studies specifically. If you're inspired to make a donation on his behalf to continue the work he began, please consider the Robert A. Burns Endowment, which funds these events and our faculty hires and so on. This endowment was created in 2011 to honor him and is used to recruit and hire outstanding instructors and to support the Robert A. Burns Lecture Series. Our development director, Michelle Murphy, is here, right there, and would love to speak with you about it. So now we are going to draw the winner of the Bookman's gift certificate, and then we're going to have dessert. All right, who's the lucky winner? Mary Speedle. Hey, all right. Congratulations. So I think you will pick that up from right there at the desk, so yay. All right, well, thank you again for being here tonight and the wonderful conversation, and we'll continue that at dessert. Thank you.
Thanks, AP.